Alrighty friends, it is time for my favorite video to film every single year. Here is my top 10 books of 2022. Hey everyone, it's Jananie and welcome back to my channel, This Story Ain't Over. So over the course of 2022, I read a total of 64 books, which is not too bad. I did want to hit the classic 100 book goal for the end of the year, but alas, I was not able to make it. I had a really busy year with lots of stuff going on, so I think even reading 64 books was quite a feat. For today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you, as usual, my top 10 books of the year. I have ranked them for you. I'll be going through them from number 10 up to number 1. But before that, I will be telling you about some honorable mentions that didn't make it onto the top 10, but are definitely some of my favorite reads from this year and are books that I definitely think you should be picking up. One thing to note is that I've only chosen these favorites from the books that I read for the first time this year, and they're also the books that I have read, so they're not like specifically 2022 releases. These are my favorite books that I read from 2022. So first up in our honorable mentions, I have In My Dreams I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead. This one was a super popular thriller from I think last year, and I finally got around to picking it up this year and absolutely loved it. It's definitely a page turner that will just suck you in, and I found myself just being really wrapped up in the characters' drama and the different relationships and all of the secrets that were going on. Basically, this is a book about a set of friends from university who are reunited at their reunion, and there's this whole mystery of one of the members of their group having been murdered by someone else in the group. But the murder has never really been solved, even though one person was sort of pointed to as the potential murderer. So all these characters meet again at this reunion, and the book is told in alternating chapters from various perspectives and also has flashbacks from when they were in university. Definitely a really fun one and one of my favorite thrillers that I've ever read, so I highly recommend this one. Next up I have When We Left Cuba by Chanel Cleeton. This one was definitely one of my faves for the year. This is the companion slash sequel to Next Year in Havana, which I read last year I think, and which was also one of my either favorite books of the year or an honorable mention for 2021. But this one was equally fantastic, if not even more. This is set in 1960s Florida and follows one of the characters from Next Year in Havana, so one of the other sisters named Beatrice, and you're following her as she gets recruited by the CIA to sort of spy and infiltrate Fidel Castro's inner circle. But along the way, she's also just going through her own personal journey and, you know, trying to reconcile what it means to be Cuban American and also falling in love in the meantime. This one had a really beautiful love story to it, and I think Beatrice as a character herself was just so compelling, and I was just in awe of her as a person, and I just wanted to be her because she's amazing. If you're looking for a really deeply moving historical fiction with a badass main character, then this is the one to pick up. Next up, I have an honorable mention that honestly blew me away, and I did not expect to like this one as much as I did, and that is Six Crimson Cranes by Elizabeth Lim. I will go to the ends of the earth for this book and for the main character in this book because I just loved her so much. The main character is Shiori, and this is a bit of a fairy tale-esque fantasy book. It's a YA fantasy, and basically our main character ends up in a situation where she gets cursed by her evil stepmother, and she is banished from her home and made unrecognizable and unable to speak about her curse or speak at all, I think. And if she does utter a word, one of her brothers will be killed, and all of her brothers are actually turned into these cranes that are forced to just fly around, and at night they can transform back into men. And so we follow Shiori as she is just trying to find a way to break this curse and sort of figure out her new normal and figure out what's going on. And it was honestly such a great fantasy and such a great coming of age story for this main character. And although there are some pretty awful things that happen in this book to the main character, I feel like overall it was a pretty lighthearted read. It definitely had that sense of a fairy tale or a Disney movie where a bunch of terrible things happen to the main character, but the overall tone of the story is quite light and happy. That's how it felt to me. And there are multiple love interests in this book as well, which I just really enjoyed. Next up I have Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. This is another one that really took me by surprise, and I absolutely fell in love with this book and needed to get to the end and find out what happened. I love that this is just a really fraught sort of social drama about these different families and involves an element of race and also just class and privilege and that kind of thing in this small little community. And there are different characters, both old and young, and I just loved seeing the different relationships play out and how these characters thought of each other. I feel like this is a book that uses very little words to convey a lot of what's going on, and I absolutely loved that. And as someone who never really read a lot of literary fiction up until this year, I feel like this was one of the books that really got me into the genre. Speaking of literary fiction, another one that I really loved from this year was The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. No surprises with this one because so many people love this book. It has so many layers to it and examines like multiple characters across decades and really tackles ideas of race, privilege, and sort of history as well. And I absolutely loved every moment of it. I was so compelled by the characters and I wanted to know what was going to happen next. And I just felt for all of them. I think they were all very endearing characters as well. Although many of the characters have some faults to them, I think you can come to understand their motives and why they do what they do. And I appreciated the well-rounded look at these different characters. Next, I have one that I honestly thought was going to be on my top 10 list, but I obviously read too many great books, so this one didn't make it on there, but I still think it was one of my favorite books of the year and is definitely like on the cusp of the top 10, and that is Book Lovers by Emily Henry. Honestly, I just love Emily Henry's books. Anything she writes, I will pick it up, I will read it, and I will probably enjoy it. So I definitely think of this one as more of like a comfort read. It's just such a fun, cute love story, and it has this element of like publishing and books and writers, and the two main characters are an editor and an agent in publishing, and they end up meeting and end up in a small town situation and end up falling for each other. And I actually really liked the love story in this one, and the two characters in specific. I think they were very unique and quite different from her previous characters in her other books. So I like that she still has this variety going through all of her books. I'm not sure that this one hit me quite as hard as Beach Read or People We Meet on Vacation, but I did devour it quite quickly, so it's definitely a very enjoyable read for me. Alrighty, and the final honorable mention that I have is one that I was honestly so on the fence about like including in my top 10 for the year, because this was such a fantastic book, and like if you're gonna pick up one of the honorable mentions, definitely pick up this one because it was so freaking fantastic, and that is 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. This is a really beautifully written, just enchanting romance. It is definitely more of a second chance romance and involves these two characters that originally met when they were in high school and get ripped apart for reasons you will find out. And they're reunited many years later when they both meet at this like writing convention, and the two of them have become these like big successful writers, him in the literary space and her in the romance space, and they're both trying to find sort of new footing and have been keeping tabs on each other along the way as they've been writing each other into their books. It's this really beautiful romance with two main Black leads, and just their stories and the struggles that they go through to end up coming back to each other was just so endearing and heartbreaking. This is definitely one that will make you cry, but I think both of the characters were just so three-dimensional and well-rounded and just beautiful people in and of themselves that seeing them come together in this romance was just so beautiful. So yeah, definitely a major favorite for the year, and I definitely think you guys should be picking this one up. Alrighty, we are on to the top 10 books for 2022. At number 10, I have one that honestly took me by surprise, and it was one that I didn't even expect to be on my top 10 list even after reading it. Like right after I read it, I was like, oh, I really enjoyed this, but I don't know if I would put it on my top 10 list. But after many months have passed, I am still thinking about this book constantly, and I'm finding myself like wanting to go back and read it and like thinking about parts of the stories and the different things that it discussed and the way that the author constructed the story, that I am just like so impressed by the craftsmanship of this book, and I cannot help but think of it as a favorite and also one that has just got me thinking in so many ways. I feel like I'm really impressed and in love with books that make me think a lot even months after reading them, as opposed to ones that I really enjoy in the moment and then I completely forget about later. So with all that preamble, my number 10 book for the year is Blueskin Gods by S.J. Sindhu. This one is one that wasn't particularly enjoyable, I would say, in the moment of reading it, because some very awful things and harrowing things happen to our main characters, but I think it was just one of those books that just hit me in so many ways, and I just kept thinking about it for so many months afterwards, and I'm just so impressed by the author's writing. This book is basically about this young boy named Kalgi who is born with blue skin, and he lives in India, and his parents have run with this blue-skinned thing and proclaimed him like a god on earth type of situation, and they've set up this ashram and people come to take his blessings and that kind of thing. So he's really sort of been put in this mindset that he believes he is some sort of god. But as the story progresses and as he comes of age and as he starts to learn more about the world and starts to encounter other people in his world expands, and he starts to realize that all of the truths that he has been given as a child may not be exactly truths. I feel like this book tackled a lot of like historical and philosophical themes that I just wasn't expecting, and I was so intrigued by that. So to this day, I'm still thinking about it, and I feel like if I reread it, I would still be fascinated by it again. And I think Kalgi as a main character as well was just super endearing, even though he makes mistakes along the way and he can be kind of terrible at some points. I think he was such a fascinating character to follow. As a last note, I do recognize though that this book is not for everyone. I think this is a particular personal favorite for me. Also, as someone who is Tamil and reading about Tamil characters was just really exciting. So take this recommendation with a grain of salt if you are not the type of person who loves really thematic books. And if you're someone who doesn't like to read about a lot of like harrowing things in a book, then this might not be the one for you. Alrighty, at number 9, this is another unexpected one for me, and that is An American Marriage by Tayari Jones. This book had me in tears by the end and just bawling over the pages and just so astounded by the beautiful writing. This is a story about a marriage, as you can tell from the title, and it's about this marriage between these two Black American people, and they are put into this impossible situation when the man is convicted of a crime he didn't commit. And so the two of them are forced to continue their marriage as he's in jail and as he's let out of jail, and it creates this like level of tension in their relationship. And I think what I loved about this book is that it's not only about this marriage and these very human characters, but it's also about this like condition of America and how America allows this sort of situation to happen. And it's chock full of really beautiful passages and letters that they write to each other and really fraught moments between each other. I think what I loved about the characters in this book is that no one is really good or has all the right answers or is always right, and each of them comes with their own personal flaws that affect the relationship and what's going on in the story. And I think that brought so much color to the story and made it so interesting to read about. It felt like so vivid to me because the characters were just so well written. This is a really epic and stunning love story, but also one that doesn't necessarily have a happy ending, and I think that is what's really beautiful about it. In 8th place, I have another book that took me totally by surprise, and that is The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. This is a book that I read earlier this year as part of my book club, and I had expected to enjoy it, but I didn't expect to love it as much as I did and completely fall into the story and just be sucked in by it. This is a really epic sci-fi fantasy that is sort of set in our real world, so it's got this like urban fantasy element to it and sci-fi element to it. And what's so cool about this book is that it follows 5 different characters, I think 5 or 6 different characters that each represent a borough of New York City, and they're all sort of assembled together because there's this situation that is rocking the city and an enemy that is on the horizon, and they are forced to sort of come to terms with their position as this kind of avatar, and they're coming into contact with the other avatars who really just embody that borough. And so it was so interesting because you are both getting to know the characters as they are as people, but also as like this metaphor for a specific borough in New York City, and it was just super interesting to see that come together. I think N.K. Jemisin has an incredible imagination, and just the way that she thought of this whole story was just so fascinating to me, and the way that it all comes together was just so cool. If you're really into sci-fi fantasies, you cannot go without reading this one because it was absolutely fantastic, and I think it really did a great job of bridging the fantastical with the real world. Alrighty, at number 7, I have the only memoir on this list, and this is one that everybody and their mom, I think, really enjoyed this year, and that is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. This book is by no means a happy or joyful book. It is definitely one that is filled with very harrowing stories and very dark things that happened in Jeanette's life. But I think the bravery it took her to write all this down and put it out into the world was just so amazing to me. And she has this writing style that is just really compelling and quite funny as well, which I think makes the overall storytelling aspect of this book quite fun. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Jeanette McCurdy was a child actress, and she played Sam on iCarly and also on Sam and Cat. And in this book, she sort of goes through her experience as a child actor and also the abuses that she faced from her mother and how that affected her throughout her life, even into adulthood and even after her mother died. If you're looking for a really personal story that will just suck you in and have you both laughing and crying, then this is definitely the book for you. I personally listened to this one on audiobook and listened to Jeanette narrate the story herself, so I think that really added added to the experience and you felt like you were just hearing the story from her over dinner. Alrighty, at number 6, I have yet another one that totally took me by surprise. I had heard one of my friends talk about this one on social media and then decided to pick it up many months later and absolutely fell in love with it. That book is Disorientation by Elaine Seicho. This book is one that initially I was like, ooh, I don't know if I'm gonna like this when I first picked it up, but as I started to get into the story, it just kept getting crazier and crazier, and I just fell in love with it. This is a book that examines so many different themes, which again, I'm a huge theme reader. I love books that delve into different issues, and I just love the way that a lot of them were tackled in this book. Basically, this book follows our 29-year-old main character, Ingrid Yang, who is a PhD student and who is studying this very famous Chinese poet that everyone seems to be in love with. But she's sort of going through these studies on autopilot and doesn't really know what she wants out of life beyond this. And for some reason, she's been turned down by her supervisor to do any other topics for her PhD. But Ingrid's life is about to get flipped upside down when she discovers this mysterious note in the archives, and it takes her on this crazy sort of wild goose chase that will eventually lead her to discover some very terrible things about the man that she was studying. This is a book that goes through themes of race and love and life in general, and also just the academic setting as a person of color, but it's also told in this very satirical tone, which makes it super, super funny along the way. I found myself laughing out loud while reading this book, but also just so engrossed in the story and sort of the slight mystery that's going on. I feel like this is a book that you just need to go into a little bit blind and you will be blown away, because that's how I went into it and I absolutely loved it. Alrighty, we are on to my top 5. This is where it gets intense, and these are honestly my favorite books of this year, and some of these are actually some of my favorite books of all time. I think all 5 of these books are ones that I consider like my favorite books of all time and ones that I will never stop talking about or recommending. So at number 5, this one will come as no surprise, but that is All My Rage by Sabaa Tahir. If you've been following my channel for a while, you know that Sabaa Tahir is one of my favorite authors. I absolutely love her YA fantasy series called The Ember and the Ashes Quartet, and this book is her first ever YA contemporary, and I was super excited about this ever since I heard it was coming out. And after I finally picked it up when it came out earlier this year, I just fell in love with the story and was just so broken by the really emotional things that happen in this book. This is a like star-crossed lovers story about these 2 Pakistani American teens, and there's just so much that they go through as individual people and the different struggles that they are facing, but then they are also facing this like romantic struggle as well, which I think is just so heartbreaking and also beautiful. This book is also a bit of a generational story. There are parts that are told from the perspective of one of their mothers and her experience coming from Pakistan and immigrating to America and what she faced when she got there. This is a book that will have you crying both in joy and also in sorrow, and it's about the costs of the American dream. It's the type of book that you can devour in a single day, or take piece by piece over a longer period of time to spare yourself the heartbreak, but it is definitely one that will hit you in all of the feels and get you thinking about love and life and everything in general. Alrighty, at number 4, I have another memoir, and that is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. This is a memoir that honestly broke me and took me apart and put me back together by the end, and it is such a powerful, powerful story about one woman's struggle with sexual assault and also the legal system when it comes to dealing with sexual assault cases. For those of you who are unfamiliar, this is by Chanel Miller, who was previously known as Emily Doe, or the anonymous victim of the Stanford sexual assault case. And in this memoir, she reveals her identity and goes through her story and her side of things as she was put through this sort of horrible process of trying to get justice for this crime, and also just her experience as a woman in the world and how rape culture is just so present in our everyday. This is a beautifully written and powerful memoir that will just have you thinking about all aspects of our world and how women are treated in general, but also how this like very horrible legal system exists. This is a survivor story, but also one of complete resilience and patience and just strength in this one woman who has gone through so much, and I appreciated it immensely. I think this is a book that everyone should be reading regardless of your gender or what your beliefs are. You should be reading this and considering this perspective. Alrighty, in number 3, I have one that again took me by surprise and utterly broke me. I was in tears by the end of this book, and I'm just so glad that I finally picked this one up because it had been on my list for so long. So that book is Pachinko by Min-jin Lee. I have heard so many people talk about how they love this book, and I had never really considered how much I might love this book until I started reading it and until I got to know these characters and got totally sucked into their story. I definitely don't think this book is for everyone because it does have a lot of harrowing and terrible things that happen to the characters in it, so just be mindful of that if you're picking it up. But I do think it's just very artfully done and makes for a very profound and moving story, and that will just have you feeling for these characters in a big way. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this book, it is this really sweeping and generational saga following this one Korean family as they are taken from Korea to Japan to America, and you know, these different situations, and through war and crime and like famine and so many other, you know, really big historical moments. Although the story starts with one character named Sunja in the early 1900s, it continues with many of her descendants and also people adjacent to their family, and you're seeing how the circumstances of the history that they live in, you know, are affecting their lives. And I think it was just so fascinating to read about, and it was just so moving as well. Like, all of these characters are deeply flawed people who make mistakes, and they just overall want to be loved and cared for and be happy with the ones that they love, but there are just so many obstacles in their way. As you can probably tell, I'm a glutton for punishment when it comes to the books that I read, and this one was honestly just one that blew me away, and I loved every moment of it. And I can imagine myself going back to read this again and again and again and still finding more to fall in love with. Alrighty, we're on the top 2 of this list, and I feel like a lot of you are going to know what these are before I even pull them up. But this second one is one that I know is on a lot of favorites lists this year because it just took a lot of us by storm and it was just such an amazing read. And that book is Babel by R.F. Kuang. Since the moment I heard about this book and that it was coming out, I have been excited for it. And part of me was so terrified to pick this one up because I thought it was going to let me down, but I'm so glad to say that it did not, and it blew me away in more ways than one. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Babel is an alternate history fantasy and follows this diverse cast of characters, but mainly one character named Robin, who is taken from Canton, China, and brought to England to study at Oxford and become one of these translation students who are part of this like institute at Oxford called Babel and are responsible for part of the magic that makes the British Empire run. This is a book that examines colonialism at its core and many of the evils of it. It really delves into the history that makes our world what it is today, and I think that part of this book is what makes it. I know a lot of people like talking about how this is a dark academia, and it is, but I think that is just one small aspect to the overall amazingness of this story. It tackles so many historical themes and just themes that are relevant to our current day as well. This is a book that again will make you cry and will make you laugh and will just hit you in all of the feels. It's about the power of language, and it's an exploration of identity and belonging, and there are just so many themes that I think you can relate to on a personal level as well. So if you're looking for a standalone fantasy that's not too dense but still chock full of really great characters and themes and world building, then this is definitely the book for you. Alrighty, we are on to the final book on this list, my #1 favorite book of 2022, and I've talked about this book so many times this year because I literally read it in January and I've been talking about it non-stop since then. But that book is Kaigei by Vaishnavi Patel, my all-time favorite book of this year and probably of all time. I love this book so much, and I think there's so many aspects of it that are very personal to me and part of why I love it so much, but I do think overall, objectively, it is a fantastic book and fantasy and just like literary masterpiece. Kaigei, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is this feminist retelling of the Hindu epic, the Ramayana, and this book takes a very minor character named Kaigei, who is known as sort of an evil stepmother character in the epic, and shows us her side of the story. We follow Kaigei from when she's a young child into her adulthood and many of the events of the epic, and there's also some extra magical elements that are added to the story in this book that I think make for a really beautiful tale. If you're familiar or a fan of the mythology, then you will be fascinated by the different characters that come along and make their appearances in the story. But I also think even if you're not familiar with it, I think it's a very classic story that will be very familiar to you regardless. If you were a fan of Circe by Madeline Miller, then this one is very similar to that, and I think personally even better done. Particularly in the feminist aspects of the story, I think this book does such a great job. It's really a story about women and their relationships with each other and how they're trying to help each other make their way in this world that really doesn't value them. It is both a really lyrical and beautifully written story, but also one that is very plot driven, which I think really appeases any type of reader. Kaige will always have a very special place in my heart, and I'm always astounded by this book, and I'm always so excited when people pick this one up. So if you ever end up reading Kaige by Vaishnavi Patel, definitely let me know. Tag me in your stories on Instagram or your tweets or whatever it is, and I will repost because it just makes me so excited when people pick this one up. And with that said, those are all of my favorite books from 2022. I always love doing this video, and it always just makes me so happy to talk about my favorites for the year. And I also know that a lot of you get lots of recommendations from these videos at the end of the year. Definitely let me know if you've read any of the books that I talked about today and what you thought of them, and if they're your favorites or not so much your favorites. And definitely let me know what your favorites of 2022 were. Leave your top 10 list in the comments because I definitely want to go through them and find some new recs for myself. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you want to get regular updates on my reading and what I'm up to, then check out my Instagram, Twitter, Goodreads, and TikTok in the description down below. And if you're looking for another video to watch from me, check out this video from last year where I talk about my top 10 reads of 2021. I always love chatting about my favorite books with you guys. So as always, please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!